The Outsiders had been brought to my attention from a bunch of little 12-year-old kids who wrote me a letter that that was their favorite story. And I really felt when I made The Outsiders that I was making it for those little kids who had written me the letter. The style was extremely saccharine. The boys were reading Gone with the Wind during that book, and so we thought, we would play with photography and even music that was, sort of like Gone with the Wind-like. So, I was sort of struggling with Outsiders at the time because I thought it was too candy-colored and too sweet, and the emotions were too on the nose. And the truth of the matter is that it takes, God knows, 6 months to make the movie, so you're imprisoned in this style. And it made me want to have the antidote, is the only way I can express it, which I found in Rumble's book. While I was actually shooting Outsiders, I felt, well, here there's a character, motorcycle boy, who's colorblind, so that whereas Outsiders was all color and Technicolor, Rumblefish could be black and white because he couldn't see color. Then I began to fantasize while I was still shooting Outsiders of how much fun it would be to do Rumblefish, because I could do it like, in my mind, I thought of it as an art film for teenagers, that it could be like a lesson in lenses and photography and unusual angles, and specifically broaden the cinematic language for teenagers. Cinema that was more active with your imagination. I never had an experience where I began to fantasize about making a different movie right while I was shooting another. In fact, I suggested to the studio, let me go right from Outsiders to Rumblefish, and they were very adamantly against that idea. And so I got a different studio to finance it, and I did it just as I wanted to. I went right from Outsiders right into Rumblefish. I make it a point to deliberately try to discover and verbalize what the theme of the piece is, and preferably in a few words, before I really have done the screenplay or gotten too deep into it, as the way to try to decide what the style is, because I always fancied myself as someone who made every film in a different style. Apocalypse is certainly very different than Godfather, and so forth and so on. That I myself personally, and even as a young person, especially liked movies in which you could see the director's style applied without shyness, that you really could see. I mean, if a camera angle is this way instead of this way, it's obvious that it's crooked, so that there's a sort of unabashed freedom to doing that. And I saw that in Stanley Kubrick, John Frankenheimer. Usually those films were a little more audacious. Certainly Citizen Kane, very notably different than just the kind of normal filmic storytelling. I liked theatricality, and the most famous director of a peculiar cinematic style in my teenagehood and after would be Alfred Hitchcock. And Alfred Hitchcock got his whole style from the German Expressionists because he was sent to Berlin when he was about 19 and hung around looking at the work of Murnau and Fritz Lang and Pabst and those people. So a lot of the style of Rumblefish did come from the silent era, and specifically Germany. Youth films had always been from the Bikini Beach films and Where the Boys Are, even artistic films for teenagers, Rebel Without a Cause. They were always depicted in a kind of high school color, where the color was an important part. So I was intrigued with the idea of making a film specifically for teenagers and making it in black and white. I'd always thought that black and white was really a style of a poetic realism. Like View from the Bridge, it was like real people, the dock workers, whereas in fact black and white is not realistic at all. And even when in college I would do plays, and I did a production of Streetcar Named Desire that was like a black and white movie in the theater, except when Blanche appears and she begins to put Chinese lanterns, little blues and pinks as she extends her fantasy world to this more black and white world of Stanley Kowalski, until at the end when he rapes her And they take her to the asylum. It's all black and white again. So I was conscious even as a student with the effect of black and white as something super real. It was unique to Rumblefish in that whatever I was thinking of at the moment, I would do it that way. So everything I did had a peculiar style or slant that even I didn't totally know, but that felt right for that material. I've done every kind of rehearsal you can imagine, and always very different for each project. In Outsiders, I did a lot of work to try to energize the discrepancy between the poor kids and the rich kids. I had the actors playing the rich kids in better accommodations with nicer cars picking them up, and they got more per diem, so that the poor kids would be. We were even shooting some of the rehearsals, and we had invented this thing that enabled us to take a picture. Say there was a picture of a house with a fence. We had the ability to have the actor walk in behind the fence. And there might be, in the back of my mind, some scheme as to what this is going to result in stylistically, but it's more of a workout to sort of test every element of the project before you actually get to make it. I actively wanted there to be a digital cinema because I thought it was more promiscuous. You could do anything with it. Also, all of this always backs up my earliest wish to basically make kind of live cinema. I came from theater, and I was, kind of a boy scientist, and I was well aware that the technology was changing rapidly, and I could see that suddenly you could do little tests with photographs and chroma key and stuff. So I was always using the technology that was, and that set a process loose at trying to find an identity for each of the characters, because they weren't going to just all be able to be in the jacket. So Rusty James arrived at a certain look that was very attractive for his youthful physique. He was a beautiful young man, and we put the club jacket on Smokey. But when it came to Motorcycle Boy, he had been the leader of the gang, but somehow just Mickey Rourke's unique personality, the more I thought about him, the more he somehow began to look to me like a kind of French intellectual. I don't know where I got that from my brother, no doubt, because I knew about Gide and Camus and Sartre from hearing my older brother who was very interested in them. So in the effort to solve what these guys were going to wear, which we had to decide because in 2 weeks we were going to start shooting, and when he came back, he had clearly gone into a new realm. What could that have been? And I just took it there because I think of the influence of my older brother, who was, the first intellectual in our family. They are the photographer's crew. They're not the director's crew. And I worked with some great photographers, but they were also stern, so that I was constantly in a feeling of frustration that I wanted to do something. And if the photographer frowned on that idea, it kind of wouldn't get done. So on Rumblefish, I always wanted to break free of all those people telling me what I couldn't do. And I was blessed to have a wonderful photographer collaborator. And Steve, I had learned already, having worked with him on Outsiders, he was very clever and UCLA colleague of mine, and technically very adept. And so when it was a question of how we would do some of these things, I leaned on him. And how we conceived of using a Chapman boom and putting the body of Rusty James on a kind of a body molded tray to hold him so we could just raise him up and fly him around and stuff. All of that was done step by step, to do it without digital effects and do it more with old magician tricks. Made me excited to want to go in that direction. Techniques such as painting light and shadow on walls to create lighting effects that were in fact artificial to get dramatic effects and stuff. My attitude, I know, and I'm sure I encouraged all of my collaborators, we want to do everything. And I would do anything that was perverse and different and seemed to be leading in a new direction. But it also makes the process sort of one of a kind. You feel like a pioneer. And my instincts have proven right more times than wrong. But telling Chris Marker he could shoot the second unit of Tulsa didn't work out too well. You know, I liked Chris Marker. I liked him personally. I liked his films. And I thought, who knows, maybe he'd be able to contribute. So I invited him to come and possibly shoot second unit material of Tulsa. But when he got here, he thought Tulsa was so ugly, he just turned around and left. But telling a guy who was a drummer that he could write the score, who had never written the score, that worked out really well. Originally, I was going to write the music, and we had, as right here in this room, we had established a kind of motif. It was a string bass, which I played, and Roman played this kind of figures on the drum.
Mr. Harrigan wants you in his office.
Rusty, you've been here to see me before.
Don't call me Rusty.
And we had this prototype, and when we hired Stuart Copeland to be the instrumentalist to play those very elaborate kind of rhythmic patterns, you have this palette of these wonderful talents helping guide me to what I was looking for. You know, a person like me, I just do what I feel like doing, and I don't often have a good reason. I really liked Rumblefish, although I was very disheartened when I had a preview for the audience I had made it for, namely, you know, high school kids, and they just didn't know what was going on with it and rejected it pretty, I think, conclusively. But that's why I was so touched to hear many years later that this group of Chilean and South American teenagers discovered it on their own and made it a important film without even knowing who the hell I was.